Iran's crisis, the generational war. Iran is not facing a protest wave. It is not living through a temporary crisis of prices, sanctions, or leadership popularity. Iran is living through a generational war. Not a war of borders or weapons, but a war of memory versus experience, of ideology versus daily life, of inheritance versus choice. To understand this moment, we have to go back nearly half a century. In 1978, Iran's streets filled with young people demanding change. They were joined by their parents, protected by families, endorsed by clerics, sustained by the bazaars. And when the moment came, the army hesitated to fire on the nation's children. That alignment, youth, parents, elites, and moral authority, collapsed the regime. The revolution that followed promised independence, justice, and dignity. For a generation shaped by dictatorship and foreign domination, those promises felt real. But revolutions age. Today, Iran is ruled largely by the same generation that once protested. Many of the men at the center of power were young revolutionaries in 1979, commanders during the Iran-Iraq War, architects of the post-revolutionary state. They did not inherit this system. They built it. Their children grew up under it. Their grandchildren are now coming of age inside it. And this is where the rupture begins. More than 60% of Iranians are under 35. They have no lived memory of the Shah, no emotional attachment to the revolution, no patience for ideological sacrifice. What they know is compulsory rules over personal life, moral policing, restricted speech, economic stagnation, global isolation, a future that feels indefinitely delayed. For them, the state does not represent liberation. It represents intrusion. This generation is not mobilized primarily by hunger. It is mobilized by control over identity, control over how they dress, how they speak, how they live, how they imagine their future. These are not transactional demands. They cannot be negotiated with subsidies or promises. They are demands of autonomy. And this generation is not isolated. They do not rely on official narratives to imagine the world. They see it, constantly. They compare their lives not to the past, but to their peers elsewhere, how young people speak to authority, how governments respond to dissent, how futures are built instead of postponed. Comparison is corrosive to imposed limits. A system can demand sacrifice when it controls the horizon. It struggles when the horizon is visible. Total information control can freeze time. Partial control only accelerates frustration. And Iran exists in that second condition. Women stand at the center of this confrontation. Not symbolically, but because their bodies have become the front line of state authority. When moral enforcement becomes daily, visible, and coercive, resistance becomes inevitable. And once defiance becomes public, old methods stop working. Visibility changes everything. The parents stand in the middle. They remember the revolution's hopes. They remember war, sanctions, funerals, and survival. They fear instability. But they fear something else as well, that their children are being asked to live smaller lives than they did. So they do not march in the streets en masse. But they no longer defend the state. They fall silent. They withdraw cooperation. They stop persuading their children to obey. That silence is not loyalty. It is erosion. This is why today is not 1978. In 1978, youth rebelled. Parents supported. Elites defected. Clerics offered an alternative authority. There was a shared direction, even if its consequences were misunderstood. Today, youth reject. Parents hesitate. Elites close ranks. No single alternative authority exists. There is shared rejection, but no shared blueprint. That does not stabilize the system. It hollows it out. Since 2019, something fundamental has changed. Protests no longer end with concessions. Repression no longer restores fear. Apologies no longer restore trust. Each cycle leaves behind less legitimacy, deeper memory, lower fear thresholds. the state still governs. But belief is gone. A system can rule without love. It can rule without trust. It can even rule without enthusiasm. But it cannot rule indefinitely without meaning. And meaning is generational. Once a generation concludes that a system does not speak for them, that conclusion does not reverse. This crisis will not be decided by a single week of protest. It will be decided by whether a state built by one generation can govern another that no longer recognizes its authority. This is not a moment of collapse. It is a moment of irreversible separation. This is Iran's generational war. Quiet. Visible. Unresolved. And history is clear about one thing. When belief dies, power eventually follows, not suddenly, not cleanly, but inevitably.